Hi, my name is Hannah, and today we're interviewing James. James is an international investor, cross-border attorney, entrepreneur, and a public speaker. His experience includes all aspects of business law, corporate and securities matter, IP and technology law, dispute resolution. Today he gave us his view on the social, legal and economic trends as we emerge into a post-pandemic world.
This podcast channel is about you, successful international entrepreneurs, successful expats, successful investors. Sponsored by HCJ.tax.
And we're live. James, good evening. How are you? Good to see you.
Great. Thank
you.
Great. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Thank you very much. It's actually morning where I am. I'm on the other side of the world, but it's good to connect with you. So for the few people that don't know who you are, could you please introduce yourself?
I'm James Hall. I'm an attorney. I suppose I'm an entrepreneur and an investor and a public speaker as well. My background is I started out my career as an engineer. I worked for a short time doing that, and then I went to law school. And then eventually I found myself doing other things as well. I started a couple of companies. I've been involved in some venture capital and private equity ventures, and I do some public speaking from time to time.
Okay. And what sort of topics do you typically speak on?
So a lot of times it's, legal related sorts of things, but there's always a commercial background to it. Many times it's the topic of the day. Maybe today we'll speak about COVID-19, but at other times it could be something else going on in the world. After 9/11, there was talk about what would happen to the travel industry and just the general mobility of people and things like that.
Okay, wonderful. So, well, I think clearly the topic of the day needs no introduction. We are in unprecedented times, and the implications are perhaps beyond imagination, but some of them are within the realm of speculation. So in that sense, and you can choose whatever angle that you would like, whether it's legal or from an investor perspective, I leave that completely up to you. But what do you see as some of the key things to look at or to consider in terms of the impact of what we're going through?
Yes, and by way of background, I guess I would just say that I'm as much a business person as I am an attorney these days. Most of the clients that I represent, yes, I do legal work for them, but I also advise them on business conditions, and it's a lot of cross-border transactions. It's a lot of business baked into it. So with COVID-19, there are so many things to consider, just starting with the obvious, the social sorts of things. How will that change us socially in the way we interact? And one example is the way you and I are talking right now. We're not in the same room. And even if we were next door to each other, we might not be, and we probably wouldn't be, because it might and likely is counter to the current quarantine rules in the places that we're at. Then you have to think about, maybe things like personal liberties. What does this mean for us going forward? How will we be able to travel again? How will we be able to go from one municipality to another? How will we be able to go into gyms and grocery stores and department stores and things like that? And then a really interesting thing, I think, will be the financial impact of what's going to happen to our global economy. There are all sorts of things there that we could talk about.
Well, the one topic that I haven't really touched on in my conversations so far is actually civil liberties. And in that sense, I guess, given your background, perhaps you're more uniquely predisposed as opposed to some of the others I've spoken to comment on that. And especially one thing I've noticed, so I started off, because I'm based in Singapore. So I started off in Singapore, and then I ended up, when the lockdowns tightened, being trapped for like 6 weeks in Indonesia while I figure out how I'm going to get back into Singapore, because Singapore just shut its borders. And then after 6 weeks, I returned to the US. And in the US, there's a lockdown, as there is in Asia, but the way it's being defined and enforced is quite different. And the idea of civil liberties is part of the conversation. So what do you think? Is seeing that you two exist in two worlds, the West and Asia as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's really interesting. There's no doubt that government exists for times like these to protect its citizens and residents the best it can.
Yeah.
On the other hand, most countries, including our country in the United States, and I'm currently in the Philippines, and they have a very similar constitution with civil liberties involved. You have certain rights as a citizen, the right to privacy, the right to free association, the right to just live your life without undue interference from the government. And I think what we've seen from governments is not necessarily that they rejected people's constitutional rights, but that they've just sort of forgotten them in the effort to deal with this pandemic. I believe that people aren't even thinking about those sorts of inherent constitutional rights. They're just reacting. And then, sorts of crazy things happen. People get locked down. You are told that, you have to stay inside. You can't go outside, when all the science, really says that the virus is much harder to transmit outdoors than it is indoors. And there's a gap between the logic and the science of what's happening and the reality of what's happening.
Okay, fair enough. And the other point that you made in terms of finance and the role of finance, what are your thoughts on the implications to the financial markets?
Well, I think that this will definitely hurt a lot of companies globally.
Yeah.
In the U.S., where there is already a lot of outsourcing to countries around the world, including China and the Philippines and other places. I think that there's a chance that in certain respects, we could see more of that, because there will be more pressure for companies to manage their costs, having been out of business essentially for a period of months.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it is highlighted for countries, the US and many other countries, that they are not in control of their supply chains anymore. Right? So that's a countervailing factor, which would probably push countries to bring some of that supply chain back home. So there are all sorts of things that are going on here, but I would guess that companies and countries may move out of China to some degree and into other countries. Thailand, Vietnam in this part of the world, and maybe others around the world.
So, for a lot of observers, it has been like a supply chain story, in the sense that was one of the most immediate impacts when you have a lockdown, disruption to your supply chain. And then in the midst of that, you had economic nationalism, and that was a push that actually started before the pandemic. One can argue that there was a trend towards greater nationalism. That's why we have Duterte. That's why we have President Trump. That's why we have Brexit. That's why we have going on Australia, number of work permits down in Hong Kong, whatever. So, there has been a push for the last X number of years towards nationalism. And perhaps this just exacerbated it or accelerated it. So you have Japan having a multi-billion-dollar fund from their government to encourage onshoring or at least getting companies out of China. The trade war was a trade war before there was a viral war. In Europe, in France, in Germany, they were already, and they are now more so, looking at erecting barriers, particularly against China. So I don't know, it just seems as if there's like a dialectical struggle going on, to use Marxist terminology. Not that I am Marxist, but I think it's an interesting way of framing it. In one sense, you do have that greater push towards nationalism and onshoring, if not nearshoring. But at the same time, to your point, there's going to be pressures on margins. Companies need to survive, and you survive by managing your costs. And if you're in a high-cost jurisdiction, you look for a lower-cost jurisdiction. So how does one reconcile those, if possible?
Well, you watch, you listen, and you try to, read the tea leaves and see the trend. But what I can say, which is, not a new concept, but a crisis usually just accelerates existing trends. So if we know of existing trends, then we can probably logically assume that what's going to come out of this is going to be a hastening of those trends. And as you said, these sorts of things were already happening. So I think there's also a timing element to this too. If countries can get back to some sense of normalcy in terms of their economy, and if there can be some comfort that the virus is under control, maybe even with a vaccine, or at least an ability to quickly identify who has the disease and who doesn't, then maybe we can go back to some sense of pre-COVID-19 normalcy soon. Mm-hmm. But the longer that takes, I think the more change we're going to see going forward. And it's just really hard right now to determine what's going to happen. You have people who are, saying we're going to have a vaccine before the end of 2020, maybe even by October. And that would be fantastic, I think, for a lot of people. The U.S. stock market has reacted very positively to that news and the reopenings of state economies. On the other hand, if it doesn't work out that way, I'm not sure that the financial markets will continue to maintain their upbeat attitude, and companies will become more and more pressured to take drastic action. So it's really hard to see. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. Anything goes. And at the same time, there are people, there's, I guess, experts who think that even though things, there's a flattening of the curve, like in Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, even here in the US, at the same time, people are predicting another wave, right? So maybe to some extent, people call it pumping the brakes. I've seen people call it a yo-yo effect. Maybe the cycle of lockdown and reopening, that is the new norm. And if not COVID-19, then COVID-20, because it mutates, right? Or there may be something else. Who knows, right? So there are those, and who believe that we should expect more and not a return to normalcy, that this is a new norm. Warren Buffett, he did his annual talk earlier this month, and I noticed on his balance sheet he has like I think 41, 42% of his equity in cash. And he explained, that's money not doing anything, right? Cash in treasuries. And he's saying, well, basically he's hinting that he's hoping for the best, but he's preparing for the worst. And so in that sense, I'm one for being optimistic, but at the same time, one, I guess, should reasonably prepare for a less than favorable outcome. Maybe we won't get a vaccine by the end of the year, like President Duterte says. Maybe it'll take 18 months to 2 years, some people say. So in that way, at least for the next couple of years, we somehow need to pivot and prepare. And I guess how you do that will really be a function of what sort of business you're in, or what is the nature of your profession. But as I see unemployment here in the US, going on the wrong side of 20%, and McKinsey says it's heading to 25. Some people say 30. And that's twice, at the height of the GFC in 2008, we went to 10% unemployment. So we're already 2x that. So I don't know. I'm trying to be optimistic, but I still think we just need to buckle in and prepare for the worst.
I agree. I see that, because this is an election year in the U.S. and because the U.S. is one of the leading countries in trying to figure out a solution to both reopening and to controlling the coronavirus, I think anybody who has a political dog in the fight maybe almost can't help but color their analysis with politics. So one side will want to say that the economy is going to come back strong quickly and that a vaccine is just around the corner. And the other side thinks, okay, well, that's not going to happen. We're going to be in a down economy for a while, and we're going to have some serious health concerns going forward for a protracted period of time. How do you know which is true? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but we don't know where that middle is. I think all we can do is just try to step back, try to filter the politics out of it, and think about, no matter really who's right on this, we know that there will be changes. So can we identify what those changes are? Can we organize our personal lives to align with that, as well as our financial and professional lives? So for instance, you and I are talking by Zoom right now, and the technology seems fantastic. Children attend school remotely now. At the grade school level, high school level, college level, graduate school level. And probably a lot of people are thinking, gosh, why am I spending so much for education when, I really don't need any of that stuff that I was paying for. I don't need those buildings. I don't need those expensive teachers with me every day. Education may change, right? The way you and I work and all of us work may change. People may travel less. Will almost certainly travel less. A lot of people may be remote permanently. I mean, you hear that from companies like Google and others. I know one of the clients that I do work for in this part of the world is the Asian Development Bank. And I think that they probably will, will take a similar position with remote work. I think that they are very clearly focused on getting their work done. It's very important work, but also protecting their people. So we may never go back to exactly the way things were before.
Yeah, fair point. And you started off talking about politics. Maybe I can take you down that road for a bit, if you're willing. But what are your thoughts on the president election cycle in the U.S.?
Well, I've never seen such a polarized political time in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and I find it it's reality, but I find it disappointing,
Mm-hmm.
unnecessary. On the other hand, I can sort of understand how it could have come to be this way, but it doesn't serve really anyone's interest. It certainly doesn't serve the average person's interest. The average person, we have more in common than we have different. We're all just trying to take care of ourselves and our families, to be healthy and happy, and to kind of live in America, live the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
So we agree probably on far more than we disagree on. We probably agree on 90+% of pretty much any issue that arises. And then when we disagree, it's usually only about how we get from point A to point B,
Mm-hmm.
not whether, we need to take that journey from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really unfortunate. I think the media has a hand in this by also promoting discord and portraying disagreements between people far worse than they really are.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no question that things are very polarized right now, and that does not serve anyone's interest. It is not good for the United States. It wouldn't be good for any country for its citizens to be so polarized. We should be working together, not against each other.
Absolutely. And for people who do what you're doing, cross-border investment, looking at international opportunities through the eyes of an entrepreneur, what I don't know, what advice do you have? What words of guidance would you have for anyone doing what you do at this point in time?
I think I would be very cautious.
Mm-hmm.
I would use this time and I would go back to what I said before, that a crisis accelerates existing trends.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had an existing trend in your business or in your investment profile that concerned you, now is a very important time to really take a close look at that and fix that.
Mm.
On the other hand, there will be opportunities if you have cash, and I think that's why I agree with Warren Buffett that people who have cash in a crisis are the king. They have choices that they can make. That's a good place to be in. So I would look at things to do with your money that will survive and thrive this pandemic, regardless of whether it goes for another 6 months or a year or longer, or whether it gets resolved quickly. We know that there will be changes. We know that there will be changes in travel. We know that there will be changes in people going to movie theaters and concerts.
Mm-hmm.
We know that this sort of technology that we're using to talk right now is going to become ever more important.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about remote work and education.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't talked about restaurants and hotels and things like that, but to the extent that they are only allowed to operate at limited capacity or with certain social distancing, those businesses still have the same costs, right? They have 100% of the cost, but if you tell them they can only have 25% or 50% of their normal customers, how do they generate the revenue to pay for everything?
Absolutely.
The cost of goods probably will go up.
Mm-hmm.
Supply chains have been disrupted. Supply chains may be moving back to individual countries, and that will cost people more.
Mm-hmm.
It just will. So I think there are a lot of things we can do from a personal point of view to insulate ourselves from the coming changes, and even to find opportunities there. For instance, I know on the investment side of things, we look at companies, not only in the U.S. but overseas as well. what we've seen so far is, because fortunately we have, these companies have cash, they're able to invest, but they're being very cautious. And likewise, the potential sellers of, investment interest, whether it's a publicly traded company or whether it's a private company, the harm from the financial harm from the pandemic has not really fully caught up to them yet. So they haven't wrapped their minds yet fully around the fact that their business has been hurt in a long-term and maybe permanent way. But very soon, in the coming weeks and months, that is going to change. And you see this every day. You see it with bankruptcy filings. Let's look at airlines. Let's look at even governments who are, even in the U.S., state and even some local governments are, facing kind of bankruptcy type situations. So there will be a lot that we can predict no matter how this goes.
And that was a great overview, I think, of some of the sectors and the obvious and potential impact. But what about geographies? What are your thoughts? Where would you position yourself in terms of looking for opportunities now globally?
I think in terms of supply chain, countries like Thailand and Vietnam are poised to grow their share of that work. I saw recently some publication from, I think it was maybe the Japanese Chamber of Commerce, because they're one of the countries looking at adjusting their supply chain. And those are some of the countries that they're looking at. I would also think that the Philippines would be a place that people might consider for outsourcing, because the English language is spoken so widely here, and because of the traditional connections between the Philippines and the United States, as well as parts of Europe. So beyond that, I would look at other potential markets that have the same ingredients for outsourcing. In the United States, closer to home, certainly Mexico is right next door. There is an existing trade agreement between the United States and Mexico. So you would think that that would be a good place for near sourcing. I think countries might also do some insourcing, or what I would call insourcing. So rather than have work done in more expensive locations like New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco, you might send that work to someplace in South Dakota or somewhere in the South. I think those sorts of things could happen too.
Okay. That's an insight that I didn't think of before. I mean, I get, everyone is, hyping up Vietnam as being one of the winners. I think recently Indonesia got some good news in terms of factories going down there. But even within the U.S., I mean, that's a great point. Someone was commenting, I think earlier this week, on movement in New York, like out of Manhattan. Upstate or whatever, as businesses and individuals no longer want to live in a densely populated city, because without the thought that this would happen again. So that is a great point in terms of looking for opportunities in terms of geography, especially for people who are into real estate. That could be helpful, I think.
And let's not forget that whoever wins the U.S. election in November, they're going to have to put people back to work, or they're not going to be in office for very long, or their time in office is not going to be very pleasant, because with double-digit plus unemployment rates, that's really a bad place for the country to be in. So another thing I would look at within the U.S. and even in Europe, and for instance, in places where Amazon operates. Not that I'm plugging Amazon, but Amazon is a fact of life, and Amazon has distribution centers in various places across the U.S. and Europe and other parts of the world. I would guess that, that type of business would only grow, and that those areas around their distribution centers would probably grow as well, because the resellers, the people who sell on Amazon would presumably want to be close to a distribution center to keep their costs lower. And I think that those sorts of areas could grow in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. James, you've given us a lot of food for thought. I appreciate you sharing your time and your insight. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I hope the political portions of our discussion, don't don't result in us being, turned away or banned or anything like that. But I think we pretty much kept it down the middle of the road.
I think so as well. I think we're fair and balanced. To borrow someone else's tagline.
You might want to be careful with that tagline, but yes, I think
I should edit that out.
I think we addressed it practically as two people who just like to figure things out.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.